Welcome to A Better Divorce podcast, where we have conversations about the emotional, financial, and legal issues that are on your mind or should be on your radar if your goal is to keep your divorce out of court. I'm collaborative divorce attorney and mediator Andrea Vacca, and I know that how you divorce matters to your long-term well-being. That's why it's my mission to help you have a better divorce with as little acrimony as possible, so that you can create the best life possible on the other side of your marriage. Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Andrea Vacca, and I'm happy to welcome Alison Arden Besunder to a Better Divorce podcast today. Hi, Alison.
Hi, Andrea. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So Alison is a partner and chair of the Trust and Estates Group at the law firm of Goetz Fitzpatrick here in New York, where she helps clients with estate planning, prenuptial agreements, business succession planning, estate litigation, guardianships, and more. So Alison, it's great to have you here. I'm so glad you could join me today to talk about how prenuptial agreements can help clients actually have a better divorce. Great. So why don't we start off? Can you just say a little bit about what a prenup is and what are some common reasons that you hear your clients want one?
Sure. Well, I always like to say that a marriage is a business relationship like any other. So a prenup is at its core concept is a contract. So it's really a contract about how certain things are going to happen on various elements if and when the relationship ends. And so I always like to say, and I know you do too, all relationships end in death or divorce. I know it's kind of sad to say that, a little pessimistic, but we deal in reality and facts and pragmatism. So, and so a prenup really talks about what's going to happen when the marriage ends. And in terms of how are we going to divide our assets? Are we going to keep our assets separate? And we're going to probably get into a little bit of this. And so that's really what it is. It's just that you've spoken in advance about the common things and the common elements that will need to be decided at the end of the marriage if it is going to terminate in divorce or if it's going to terminate at somebody's death, or even sometimes if the people just decide they're going to stay married but maybe live apart.
That's right. And it is pragmatic, but it's true. All marriages end, and these agreements help couples have a conversation and talk about what's important to them. So we've worked on prenuptial agreements together several times now.
And they've all been a pleasure.
They have been, which is wonderful, because we help our clients talk to each other and have conversations. We talk about what's important to each of them so that they can have a healthy conversation about this. It's not just two lawyers talking at each other. That's how I've experienced, working with you. It's been really pleasurable, and I think our clients benefit from that. But
absolutely,
right. So prenups are, I see they're becoming much more common and more the norm for younger couples who are getting married for the first time. But we also know that they're very popular and have been for even longer for couples who have been married before, whether their marriage is ended by death or divorce. And they're hoping that this will be the last time they get married, but they want to protect what they have. And they're hoping not to go through it again. So if they do divorce, though, they want to make sure that this prenup allows them to have a better divorce possibly than they had the first time, which in my book means less adversarial, less expensive, more streamlined. So how would you say it's different? What do you see? How are prenuptial agreements different for first marriages versus second or third marriages?
Right. Well, starting from the how our second or third marriage is different from the first. I mean, it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking, they say till death do us part, but it really should be till death or divorce do us part at the altar. Second marriages are different because, number one, people generally are in their 30s. They're not in their 20s. So just by definition of age, maturity, a little bit, having been through it the first time, knowing what kind of divorce they had the first time, and knowing what kind of relationship they're going to have. But I think most importantly is that they have children from the first marriage. And when you get married a second time, you're not just acquiring a spouse, you're acquiring their children too, whether you like it or not, whether you like them or not, because there are assets and there is an expectation, I think, in the culture, even though there's no legal obligation, but there's an expectation that a parent's assets are going to be left to the first set of children, right? It becomes even more complicated if the people are young when they get married for the second marriage, and now there's a new set of kids, right? Or on the third marriage, and there's a third set of kids. I think one of the other interesting complications is where one spouse, it could be the wife, it could be the husband, or it could be same-sex marriage. Now they're marrying the generation down below. And by that, I mean 15 years younger, or now the third wife is 30 years younger. And so you're dealing with different generational issues along the way. And you're dealing with more personalities, more dynamics. And so in a second marriage, when we think about second marriages where people are getting into the second marriage where the kids are already adults, or they're already in college, the parents' responsibilities are different, their objectives are different. And now, as they acquire a long term second marriage, there are more loyalties and obligations to the spouse, and they want to balance that with their obligations to the children, some of whom may be financially successful, some of whom may not be. It might be a mix and match. So, those are all some of the ways. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of how the subsequent marriages are different.
Yeah. And, bringing up adult children, I'm seeing more and more that parents, parents are still really financially supporting their adult children. Maybe all of them, maybe some of them. And so that should be talked about. You should be, the prenuptial agreement should address, like, are we going to is money that we're earning during this marriage going to be going to children from a prior marriage? So if it's pursuant to an agreement like a custody or a child support agreement because you have younger children, that's one thing. That's a legal obligation. This is a whole other type of obligation. It might be ethical. It might be, just emotional obligation that a parent has. So you definitely should talk about this before you agree to commingle your assets or decide how everything's going to be paid. And I also see that if with children who, I'm sorry, let me go back. When you have this different generational kind of mindset, they might be close in age, but one party might be already or close to retiring, and the other party might not be. And so, that's a whole different way of looking at money that's coming in, money that's being spent. Do you have any advice for that type of situation where one might be close to retiring and wants the other one to come play with them, and have a retired life, but the other one's not ready to retire financially?
I mean, I always make the joke that my job is about 80% therapist, maybe, 10% law, and the other 10% is communication. Maybe there's a different balance on that. I think the answer is, I was saying to you previously that, sometimes people retire and now they're spending a lot more time with their spouse than they had previously, as opposed to they go to work, they have a life outside of work. And now that, they're just home for dinner, and then they realize I might not like you that much. And so, any transition in life is hard. It's hard when people in a first or second marriage have little kids. And then when they become teenagers, right? It's like big kids, big problems, big adults, big problems. So I think certainly in a second marriage, and I should point out, obviously, even if there wasn't a prenup in the first place, it's never too late to do a nuptial agreement. And also to revisit it. So the same thing that I tell people with estate planning, which is it's not one and done. The document is done, but your life is going to move on and things change, and you should always be taking it out and reviewing it and seeing how things changed, right? And I know this is a little bit off topic of this question, but also going back to adult children that are being supported, there are people with special needs children. There are people who are supporting their sister or their mother, or they own a house with that parent or sister or whoever who's living in it, and the title's in the bride or groom's name, and but that person's living there, and all that needs to be documented because it lives inside of your head. But the people who are surviving at death, and now I'm thinking a little bit more at death, they're not going to know what to do, or is there the income to support it? So I think in the business of life, people need, especially in a second marriage, there needs to be a team of advisors. I mean, the way that you avoid legal problems at the end is to have the advisors in the beginning. And that is the matrimonial attorney doing the prenup, your estate planning attorney doing your estate planning documents, your financial advisor, your accountant. And people get very penny wise, pound foolish when it comes to this, but they really don't understand that the litigation that they're going to face for not trying to knock out some of these problems in the beginning and having a roadmap is going to exponentially cost them more money later on down the road. And also, you talk about legacy. I mean, and it's become more into the cultural language about conscious uncoupling. And I think that's a great thing, right? Because we have this tendency to move toward adversarialness, and because the anger makes us feel good. And that's like the drug of getting you through the painful times. But there's definitely another path, because that acrimony in our world just means to more fighting and more legal fees and more time. And like you said, move on with your life. Like the one precious commodity that we have that we're never getting back is time. And me personally, I would much rather that people get on with their lives and have a more efficient resolution of a dispute, whether that's the matrimonial separation, the death, all of those things. So
Absolutely. And, I refer to prenups as conscious coupling. We've heard a lot about conscious uncoupling, but that's exactly what a prenup does. Allows a couple, when things are happy and calm and hopeful, to have a conscious conversation about what they expect, what marriage might look like, what they plan on doing, what their dreams are, and see if they're on the same page. And if they're not, or even if they are, put it down, put it on paper. There's nothing wrong with that, because this is an investment in your future, in your
absolutely.
future of being just hard, the expense of litigation, but the heartache of litigation, what it might do to your future children and your extended family if you're fighting. So you don't just think about yourself. And if you're saving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars with this prenuptial agreement, you're going to argue over a few thousand for some advisors to help you get there. It doesn't make sense to
Well,
me.
it's like the Harry Met Sally quote, which I love. It's like, you're going to say this wagon wheel coffee table, you're going to spend $10,000 to the law firm. If that's mine, this is yours, over this stupid wagon wheel coffee table. And it's so true, because people lose sight of it. And what is a document? A document reminds you of what you said. I mean, how many times have I taken out my own will and be like, I made that decision? Oh,
Right.
who knew? Maybe it's time to refresh.
Even you.
But yeah, one of my other pithy sayings that I always like to say is that if you can't have that conversation in the first place, then you shouldn't be getting married, right? What is marriage if not a series of difficult conversations about really difficult things? And you're not always going to agree, and be pragmatic and learn the lessons from the last time, right? At the end of the day, there are finances that have to be addressed, right? And so I think that you have to have that conversation and at least pick out the things that you can agree on, or even just a process, right? Maybe you can agree on what the assets are going to be, what the number is, but okay, are we going to own a house together? How is that going to get divided? Are we going to sell it? How much time is it going to go on the market before we adjust the price, right? You and I have been through this, and we know all of the issues. And what upsets me the most is when somebody says, oh, I could just do this myself. And they go out to like LegalZoom and they say, oh, I did this myself. Can you look at it and tell me if it's going to work? And I'm like, I'm not, I've taken a practice after how many years have I been practicing? 25. I'm just saying, I will not.
No,
I will not look at it.
it will just cost you so much money, and I'm going to redo the whole thing because it's probably
right,
basically.
Right. And it's going to cause you more problems. And it's the same as wills. When people come to me and say they did a do-it-yourself will, they had the beneficiaries witness it, and it causes me more problems because I have to go to the court and say, there is a will, I can't probate it, but here you go, and we need to go in intestacy. So it's more expensive.
It does. So what are the main concerns that you hear when clients come to you and saying, I'm thinking about a prenuptial agreement, this is what I'm concerned about? And what they're saying, is it any different from what you think they should be concerned about?
Well, the first issue is where it becomes a challenge is economic disparity, right? Earning potential. But again, like you said, what are the retirement ramifications? How is that spouse, if they keep their assets separate, is the spouse going to separate their retirement and how they're going to support it? And let's face it, when you're married, there's only so much you can separate it, because one spouse wants to go traveling to Europe and the other spouse says, I'm not going to pay for that. So now the other spouse says, all right, well, if I want to go and I want to go with a companion, then I have to pay for you. So it's never going to be, you don't want a marriage where it's nickel and diming of like, we're right down the middle. And then, so all of those those aren't legal conversations to have, but certainly, we can help guide them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the things that they should be thinking about are, okay, so near term for sure, right? It might be too much for some people to start envisioning the future, but I think the three big things for a second marriage are going to be, how are we going to support our lifestyle now? What lifestyle are we both in, right? Obviously, there's a disclosure of, well, how much debt have you accumulated? What's your spending habit? Whose house are we going to live in? I think the second is what happens if somebody gets sick. And the third is what happens if somebody dies. And what are we going to do about the kids, right? So, and how does it look if we're in a long-term marriage, right? I mean, it's not a legal analysis, but when a second marriage is 15 years, 20 years, 35 years, and that second spouse has stood by the other spouse when they're sick or paralyzed or in a wheelchair, they're 24-hour care, it's a very different situation to say, and you get nothing, right? And how are you going to, maybe they can't support the apartment they've been living in when the spouse was alive. What do you do with that, right? The kids are chomping at the bit that they want the apartment they want it wrapped up. You're going to kick an older person out of the home they've lived in with the spouse, right? So it's a really delicate situation. And truthfully, there's only so much you can legislate in a prenup yourself. But I think the biggest thing for me is that a prenup, a will, communicates to the people you leave behind or that you are leaving behind, like, this is what I wanted, right? Please don't fight about it. This is what I wanted. I said it very clearly. I went to a lawyer. The lawyer's going to tell you that I did it, when I was of sound mind and all of those things. So I think those are really the high level key pieces, but particularly when the other spouse gets sick. And what are you going to do?
Yeah. With younger marriages, we talk about what will happen if you have children. Will that change any of these terms? Like maybe there's no spousal support paid before you have children, but upon having children and you have young children at the time of the divorce, maybe then spousal support kicks in. This is at the other end for older couples. Maybe there's no sharing of certain assets or something with regard to the home. It makes a lot of sense to be thinking about the end of the marriage or the end of your life, towards the end of your life. All those things that could happen and could change needs and expectations. And we have to help people have these conversations by thinking ahead. We have to raise uncomfortable situations and what would happen if. I ask a lot of what if questions, right? So do you mediate prenuptial agreements like I do, or do you only work with one side?
I really only work with one side. And then it becomes a little bit tricky because then they'll say, okay, can you do the estate planning documents for both of us? And I say, no, not really. And it's really the only place that I dip my toe into matrimonial. I don't do any other matrimonial, but the prenups kind of and the marital agreements deal with what is at the core of my practice, which is how are you going to deal with assets? How are you going to divide the assets? Whether that's a commercial litigation within a guardianship, your guardianships can be matrimonial actions in their own right or pre-probate contests. So I do a lot of those. But it's really all about asset protection, asset preservation. How should things be structured? What does it mean when things are, in a joint account? Does that mean that the money goes to the survivor? So all of those things of how that works out kind of go into the prenup. And I also do a lot of work with matrimonial attorneys who are doing their own divorce agreements or prenups as to advising on both the insurance provisions and then also the estate provisions, right? Because in the divorce agreement in the first marriage, you see a lot what's going to happen in the will. Are they guaranteeing that there's going to be a beneficiary designation on a certain plan? And I get a lot of litigation over that where the person or the divorced spouse says, yeah, I'm going to do it anyway and change it. And then you have litigation in that area. So.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how are prenuptial agreements part of good estate planning? And how does it play into the estate plan? Because these are contracts we're signing as opposed to unilateral wills or
Absolutely.
trust. So can you talk a little bit about that?
It's an obligation. And so I always ask when I'm doing estate planning, is there a prenup, right? Because if it's a parent of young children, I want to know what their obligations are because it's an obligation of the estate. And when you die, your obligations get paid first, right? It's a debt. You have a creditor. And ultimately, a party that you contract with is a creditor of the estate, right? So let's say that you have a prenuptial agreement that says, I am going to leave my spouse a third, right? Which is, as we know, is the right of election. Let's say that instead of waiving it, they say, I'm going to leave my spouse a third, and they don't. Well, the spouse is going to say, by the way, I'm able to do that. And also one of the things that prenup can do, and this is always a problem, is that what happens if a divorce is filed, right? There's a termination event. Maybe there is or there isn't a prenup, or hopefully a prenup addresses this, but there's a divorce pending, the person dies, but there's no divorce decree, they're still married.
Yes.
And unless you have a prenup that says on the termination event, period, full stop, we're deemed divorced, so that, and there is a waiver of a right of election, and that applies in that instance. So all of those things, the law can only provide so much. And I always tell people, I used to know the number, but I think when you get married, there are like 1,300 laws that are affected by just getting married. And nobody thinks about that. From what's that?
Federal law only.
Federal law and state law, everything from fishing licenses and how they get transferred to, ERISA and your pension plans and who can and can't be a beneficiary designation. And so a prenup helps you address all of that, because I don't think people realize that when they say I do, they're signing on to a bundle of rights that they have no idea what they are. Right.
Rights. Yep. Obligations. Yeah. There's the prenuptial agreement with regard to estate planning. Just to talk a little bit more, if you die, like one of the things we'll make clear, we'll say, will this person still be considered your spouse if you have decided to divorce? And there's in the prenuptial agreement, there's a certain term, certain conditions and events that will qualify as what we call a qualifying event, and it will, a separation event. And if you die after that, then you're no longer spouses, which otherwise would be the case. So that happened to somebody I know who didn't have a prenup, and they had this horrible contentious divorce, and the wife died of cancer while they were in the middle of this. But he got to, he was a spouse for the estate and got, a lot of money, and it caused so much anger from this person's adult children.
Yeah.
The woman who died, her adult children were furious, and there was litigation after her death, between the adult children and the husband, who had every right to this property. He was still her spouse.
Yep.
So
it's a problem in the law, and it's really, and given the length of time that the courts take to issue their divorce decrees, and I've had a couple of cases like that, and it's even worse where there's no money, but maybe there's intellectual property, or it's things of that nature, and people really don't plan, right? I think because mainly they're difficult conversations to have. It's the same with estate planning. Like, who wants to sit around and think about when they're going to die and the business of life? But it's so critical to avoid some of these things. And you're right. And the acrimony that's left with people and the regret.
It is.
Which is priceless. I mean,
generational trauma.
Right? Yep. 100%.
How, like, I know what I say, but how much time do you recommend people contact you before they want a prenuptial agreement? So we have time to talk about all these things and negotiate these terms.
First date.
First date. As soon as you're swiping.
I think for sure at the latest, like, you get engaged, like you need to really do that on the checklist of things that you need to do. It's like, set a date. You need to figure out, like, are we getting a prenup, and contact the attorney. Cause I almost universally, I don't know about you, but almost universally, I get calls from people like, it's within the 6 months of the wedding date. And that's my first question. Have the invitations gone out? Cause I can't stand it. And as there's case law on that in terms of like how soon is too soon. You want it as far in advance as possible, so that nobody's going to make an argument about duress, or they had no choice and it's going to be embarrassing. I mean, most of those fail, but I'm all about narrowing the issues that are going to come up in front of a judge who might entertain them and who might let them go along, right? You want to really close the door on a lot of that stuff. So I don't think it's ever too soon to talk to a matrimonial attorney. I mean, quite frankly, I would say, but some would say that I'm too over the top. Your divorce is finalized and you're thinking about getting into the dating world, go see a matrimonial attorney or your last matrimonial attorney and say, what are some like innocuous questions I can ask on a first date, or like as I'm in the dating process, or what should I be thinking of? Because, understand that you're going to have to face those questions. So,
I mean, people come to you within 6 months. Sometimes they come to me within 3 weeks.
I know.
Or next weekend, they'll say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Even if it's 1-2 months, it's not enough time. And,
well, I usually just tell them we're in post-nup territory. So sure, we can get started, but you're dealing with a post-nup. So, okay, just make sure you get it done. Right?
And the chances of that getting done are very slim, for that they'll actually do a post-nup agreement.
If they came to you 3 weeks before?
Yeah.
Probably. They're not planners.
Not planners, right?
Not planners.
I've worked with some people who, before they even got engaged, were talking about the prenup. So the joke is, you said first date, but really, when you're thinking, do I want to give this person, a commitment and make a commitment to this person, give them an expensive piece of jewelry, perhaps. I've worked with couples who are negotiating at that point, and it's really like a business decision. You say you mentioned, you suggest looking at it that way, don't you? Like,
Absolutely.
this is like a business.
It's a business
conversation.
It is. It's no different than, right? I have my business partners and I have my marriage partner. And at the end of the day, my grandfather always used to say that marriages fall apart for affairs of the heart and affairs of the pocketbook, right? Mm-hmm. So, ultimately, what do most people break up about? Like finances. One is spending too much. One isn't spending enough. Or financial strain, right? It's a wandering eye, and it's a financial strain on marriage. Of, are you a spendthrift, right? Are you going to put your responsibilities to your kids first, or to me, right? And people don't understand that in the state of New York, other than for minor children, you have an obligation to support your spouse. But you can cut your children out. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean if one spouse makes more money than the other? What if one spouse did make more money, but, is now in retirement? And so all of those things. But I think it's great. I mean, it actually warms the cockles of my heart that you tell me that somebody says, you know what, especially in a second marriage, right? You've already been through, the pain, even if it was a conscious uncoupling, even if it was like a touchy-feely divorce, and that's fine. Especially in a second marriage, like, have that conversation, go, consult a matrimonial attorney to do the prenup and talk about what the parameters are going to be at least. And then you can go on to the fun and the Instagram moment and the I'm engaged. Yeah, that's great.
The ring shot.
For sure. Yeah, the ring shots and everything. They didn't have that. That's how old I am. They didn't have that when I got engaged.
Right. Me neither.
I didn't have to change any status.
That's funny. Well, all right. Well, Alison, this is really interesting, and I'm so glad we were able to talk. But I do have a final question for you, as I ask all my guests. What is your one tip for a better divorce?
I think we covered a lot of them, but I think the one tip for a better divorce is the same thing that is my one tip for a successful marriage, which is approach it with compassion, and trying to see things from the other person's point of view. And not to look at it as a zero-sum game, right?
Yes. You both need to get something out of this, and you both have to feel secure, to come out of this marriage.
Yeah, and there's a reason you came together in the first place, and try to find the core of that, to find the element of being kind to the other person, and approach it with a place of kindness and not of adversarialness.
Right. I love it. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. So let's see. Where can people find you, first of all?
Sure. They can find me in a lot of places. They can find me in my office at One Penn Plaza. I'm always here. They can find me on the streets of Brooklyn, where I live. You could find me at GoetzFitz.com, GoetzFitz.com. I have a blog on the website from my old firm. So if you Google me, Alison Besunder blog, you'll find me. I am on Facebook and on Twitter, and I didn't come prepared with my handle, but I think it's at Estate Trust Plan. But all of my stuff is on my bio page on my website.
And LinkedIn, of course, too.
And
right?
LinkedIn, of course. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say before we end, or?
Just thank you very much. I always love talking shop, and particularly with you.
Thanks.
And I look forward to seeing you and working with you.
Yes. Can't wait for the next prenup together. Yep. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. This has been another episode of A Better Divorce podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode. You've been tuning in to another episode of A Better Divorce podcast with Andrea Vacca. Thank you for subscribing, leaving your positive comments and reviews, and sharing the show with others. You can watch episodes at vaccalaw.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can listen through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Bye for now, and remember, you can have a better divorce.